thank you so much for being here. One thing you might not know is I'm actually, I'm a postdoc, and my time was split between Bryn Mawr College and Michigan State University. So I'm actually part of Michigan State University, but I'm not living here. So I guess I'll just jump in the interest of time. What I'm interested in talking about is kind of what I'm calling size-energy partitioning in forests. Essentially, how much energy is fluxing through different sized trees within a forest? How much are they getting? And can we kind of link some ecological scales of an individual tree up to a whole forest? That's kind of topic. I have a lot of collaborators, especially working with Quentin Reed, who's here, Sydney Record at Bryn Mawr, Phoebe Zarnetsky, and then some people from the University of Arizona, like Brian Enquist. And one of the things that I'm interested in, and I think one of the things that's challenging in the field, is we have, there's a lot of information in ecology. There's a real diversity that's very appealing, but it can be very challenging. If you're interested in the physiology of an individual, then there's a whole wealth of data about that. If you're interested in the stand level processes, there's ecologists studying that. But to go from here to here can be difficult. And so one of the approaches is to look at something like abundance. Of course, abundance is a property of individuals that kind of scales up to the forest stand, and it potentially can be related to traits that the individual has. And so, for instance, like a trait like body size or organismal size can be affecting things like abundance. It can also affect things like the growth rate of a tree. And then if we scale those up, we can get something like the net primary production at the stand level. So we can kind of use potentially this kind of framework with, say, body size as a unifying feature, as a bridge between individual and larger scales, if we know something about how body size predicts things like abundance. And so it turns out there are some ideas of how these kind of things work out. So for growth rate of production, you can kind of loosely describe this as a power function where bigger things have more leaves, have more needles, they capture more sunlight, and they have a higher growth rate. That's pretty obvious. And so there's an increasing growth rate as you get bigger, but it turns out to follow a pretty good mathematical rule. And so we could say that the production scales with diameter to some coefficient, where that coefficient is the slope on a log-log plot. And if we're thinking about abundance and we take a snapshot, kind of visual snapshot of a forest in our mind, one of the first things we'll notice is that, of course, there are more small trees in any forest than there are big trees. And so there's going to be a relationship with tree size there as well. And the relationship also tends to follow, or at least is believed to follow, as some of their theoretical models assume it follows, a power law function as well. Log, this is the slope, and it's going to follow this exponent. It's a negative value, so we see a negative value on the exponent as it's declining. There are fewer big trees, lots of little ones. And so people like Brian Enquist have kind of put some of these ideas together to get at growth rate or to get at a tree metabolic rate. They looked at xylem transport, but there's also data on production rates and photosynthetic rates as well. They looked at the relationship with that in stem diameter. They looked at the relationship with maximum density and average mass. And they kind of put this together. And they found that these slopes more or less cancel out. So the implication was for any average plant mass, kind of collectively, they're fluxing amount of the same amount through their xylem or producing equal amounts of wood. So you could kind of think of a hectare plot where you plot lots of small trees, and it fills up, packs in, and there's all this light coming in. They convert that light into new wood. And then in a hectare plot 1 over, you have a bunch of medium-sized trees. They grow up, they fill in that area, they convert that light to wood. And then the next plot over, just a handful of really giant trees, converting light into energy. And so in all these, the net primary production might be the same in each hectare plot. But in some cases, you have a few large individuals that are doing all that production. In other cases, a whole bunch of really small ones. So in some sense, this isn't too crazy. the rate at which you use energy, if there's a certain amount of energy coming in, and that's kind of caps how much production you can get, the rate at which you use it will dictate how common you are. So if you use a lot of it per individual, then there'll be fewer individuals. If you use, small amount, a bunch of seedlings, you can pack it in. But Brian Enquist and co. kind of took this idea further, and they said, based on this kind of fractal model of how trees use resources and it sets their metabolic rates, that within a forest stand, when you have mixed age forests of all different sizes, you still also see this pattern of the small trees are fluxing, for a given size range, fluxing as much production, as much energy as the larger trees. So I'll kind of give you a visual with that. So kind of going back to the pictures, we see these two patterns here. They predict that scaling is diameter to 2 for production, diameter to -2 for density. You kind of multiply these through, or if you just summed up for every kind of size bin, the small ones, say from 0 to 10 centimeters diameter, are getting just as much as 10 to 20 centimeters, as much as 30 to 40, as much as 100 to 110. So this has been called energy equivalence, and the idea is that they're getting, on average, equivalent amounts of energy, even in a mixed age forest. Yes, it should. That was one of my little errors. So, pardon me, yes, exactly. So when you multiply these through, these two, you kind of sum exponent, and this should be m to the 0. I was changing the font size. I must have changed that value. Good catch. And it should be d to the 0. Another little one. So if we were to think about this, imagine drawing a bunch of bins, and we have your production per bin. And you can kind of sum these up, and they have equal amounts. Now, originally when Brian Coe wrote this, the idea was that whether you looked at mass bins or diameter bins, you get equal amounts per bin. Some mathematical ecologists showed that this diameter mass bin is not equivalent. So we're mostly focusing on diameter bin, which they then kind of specifies diameters, what they mean. If we try to think about this, imagine a forest is composed of a variety of trees. There's a big range of sizes from canopy trees. Here, there's a lot of sub-canopy trees. There's seedlings, but they kind of account for a relatively small range of sizes. But if we kind of divided this into equal size pie slices, so like a slice here and a slice here and throughout, each slice is about getting the same amount of energy. So there might be more slices within the canopy, sub-canopy region, but for every window, from every, say, 10 to 20 centimeters, 20 to 30, every 10 centimeter size bin, equal amounts of energy. And this idea of energy equivalence actually has had a big impact, not just in the plant literature, it's probably had a bigger kind of impact in lots of other areas of ecology, like phytoplankton, terrestrial plants. We have, it actually started with a study on mammals, the density of mammals, of herbivorous mammals, by a guy named Damith. What's his first name? I can't remember his first name. Anyway, Damith in 1981 had a Nature paper showing the scaling of density of mammals. It's declining in a way that was the inverse of the energy use per mammal. And he proposes energy equivalence. And it stimulated kind of a lot of discussion because it kind of gets at the question, how does size affect the amount of energy, the competition for energy in a system? What is the ecological significance of size, not just at an individual level or maybe at an ecosystem scale, but within communities, when they're interacting with other organisms of different sizes? Kind of what are some of the selective pressures on it? So this is the thing that kind of motivates me. So we think about how energy is partitioned between sizes. We're kind of getting to a question of what is the competitive significance of body size with respect to energy access and resource use. And so this idea by kind of Brian Enquist et al. Is a little counterintuitive because there's something going on in forests that seems challenging to understand how seedlings could be possibly getting as much energy as these larger trees. And it's that they're competing for energy, but seedlings are limited when light is blocked by large trees, but large trees are not limited when seedlings receive light, because that light has already passed through. This has been called asymmetric competition. It would be different than nutrient competition, where nitrogen pulled up by a seedling is not available for nitrogen for the larger tree, and vice versa. That would be more symmetrical. In this case, the big one seems to have the advantage, and light's believed to be limiting. Maybe only 2% is falling all the way down to the floor. So this is a bit of an ecological conundrum. And so it kind of sets up this paradox where you might assume that the big trees are getting most of the amount of the light in the forest, but the model here is that they're getting equal amounts of energy. And this model has some support when we look at the scaling of density and growth rate. So it's not inconceivable, but it is kind of hard to figure. But there's some issues with some of the previous work. So a lot of these works were between sites, not within. So they might tell you kind of the carrying capacity of a region, that you could pack an area in with a few big ones or many small ones, but not necessarily a lot about competition in the community. So that's kind of something I'm really interested in. And people have often assumed that it tells you something about community interactions, but maybe it doesn't. Total energy has rarely been measured. So the total production kind of per size group hasn't always been measured. People have looked at the size density scaling. They've looked at production size scaling, especially since the Enquist papers. Not a lot have actually kind of combined these dimensions and looked at how energy is being partitioned within sizes. And finally, a few of the ones that have done these kinds of things haven't necessarily looked at the individual scale to try to link it up to the stand. So individuals experience varying amounts of light, and it's not just a kind of average function of their size. Some small individuals in a forest or in a gap, they get tons of light, and some big individuals are getting maybe are below another large individual, not getting much light. And then there are also different traits that individuals have. There's shade tolerance metrics that affect your light use efficiency, affect your ability to deal with different amounts of light. So the goal here was to kind of link some of these things together, try to look a little bit at a more individual scale, and then expand up to the stand level to get at these kind of issues of how energy is partitioned in forests, what the significance of body size is for access to energy. So some of the questions then, to kind of restate this, how is energy partitioned between different organismal sizes? Is light limiting to production? If it is, how limiting is light? For instance, if we have lots of disturbance and gaps being created, then maybe light isn't as limiting. It's limited in certain patches, not in others. Maybe on average, it's not that limiting. In the sense that if there's enough gaps, enough turnover, maybe light is actually showing up at different heights in the forest. Maybe other resources are more important. Maybe nitrogen or phosphorus or water is more important, in which case this advantage large trees have isn't quite as strong for say light access or water access or nutrient. And then what's going on is there a real asymmetry between kind of solar capture and the metabolic energy that the previous slide suggested? And then can we link this to things like shade tolerance? To actual traits, because there's a real move in ecology to get a little more mechanistic by thinking of traits. So that's kind of what we want to do. So we wanted to build a little bit of a light limitation model of expectations. And so instead of, this is kind of an Enquist model approach, we have, it's actually increasing diameter to 2, and it's going up, but we would expect that maybe if there's light limitation, this green line here is, as you get bigger, if you're on average getting a little bit more light, then you accelerate your growth even faster than just your size would predict. Kind of diameter as the predictor unit. And then for thinking about size-density relationships, if there's strong light limitation, then maybe the small ones aren't quite as common as you'd expect. There's a higher mortality rate. There's already some good evidence that large ones are not as common as expected by a power law. And things like wind throw at the canopy level, or even drought, which is maybe more intensely affects things at the canopy level and getting direct radiation, actually limits the abundance of large trees. And so that's an idea out there with a fair amount of support. So this could be dipping away from these kind of parallel ends. And when you put that together, you might get more of a hump-shaped function. So the individuals here are suppressed in the bottom. They're not getting as much. They're not producing as much. And these guys here aren't suppressed, but they're getting killed at a faster rate. So they're not producing as much. And so the question if there's an energy equivalence, partly is it a straight line, and partly is the magnitude here very high. If it's a trivial shift, then you might say it's approximately energy equivalence. If not, not. Now, one thing I'll mention about this energy equivalence idea is that it's assumed that the forest is in demographic equilibrium. So basically, size, if individuals are growing in a size class, that's being replaced by loss. So this is something kind of like an old growth forest maybe, where there hasn't been disturbance recently. Biomass loss balances biomass gain. And you could predict deviations actually in a younger stand, which we can talk more about. So to look at this, I went to Barrow, Colorado Island, and actually went there, collected some data, but most of our work was just on using data that is available. And so they have this pretty cool system with these 5-year census. Every 5 years, they measure all the individuals that are 1 centimeter DBH and more, diameter breast height, and then there's about 7 kind of census intervals that are available that look good. And we can get things, from diameter to diameter, year to year, you can get growth rate. If you link diameter to mass, biomass production, you figure out how much has changed. We have some trait data, which I'll get into, and we have some light data as well. So we can try to link these levels at a more individual fine-grained level and see what the patterns are and why. So one of the collaborators we have is Nadja Ruger, which did some work modeling light availability. And she did this by looking at the presence or absence of vegetation in BCI every 5 meters in this 50-hectare plot. But then she excluded kind of the borders and a small patch that is younger, so we brought it down to about 42 hectares. So every 5 meters, she looked for presence, absence at these different heights, so 0 to 2 meters, 2 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. Get an idea, essentially, you can kind of build a geometric model of whether there's vegetation, and if you know if vegetation is there in the neighborhoods, then you can figure out how much incoming light should be able to be received. And there's another paper she used that actually measured PAR at different spots based on vegetation density at BCI. To kind of link those two together to figure out what percent of light is available for a tree at any given size. And she did this for two kind of 5-year windows, so we kind of know the individuals there. And so we focus on those 2 5-year windows for our light analysis. So there is a little bit of modeling, but there's a whole lot of empirical data as well. Every 5 meters, I think it was like 20,000 kind of data points she had. We also wanted to look at things like shade tolerance. And so sometimes we have these qualitative classifications that can be a little bit difficult to parse out, how real they are. But there was a really nice paper by Wright et al., which is a little bit similar to one I think that was done in the area maybe in the 70s or 80s. But they have kind of more species. Every point here is a species. And this is the growth rate, the 95th percentile growth rate. So the fast grower saplings on the bottom. And this is log transformed. So this is the relative growth rate. And then, or the axes are log transformed. And then you have the mortality rate of the 25th, the bottom quartile growers. So basically shade-suppressed individuals. And this kind of goes back to a classic idea that shade-tolerant individuals have low mortality in shady areas. They appreciate sunlight, but they can survive shady areas better than gap specialists, shade-intolerant types. And what you see is that the slow growers have low mortality rates, and the fast growers have the highest mortality rates. And so we did some cluster analysis, and the kind of division that was best supported was kind of a 2-group with the kind of gap specialists here, much more common shade tolerant down here. So we can use these divisions. We can use these divisions, and the reason why we have to divide up a little bit is because if we looked at individual species, for some of the density scaling things, you need to sum up all the individuals in a size bin. And there isn't enough data to sum up all the individuals for a given species, because species are relatively rare at BCI. So if we kind of add this shade gap distinction, we might expect the gap specialists have a stronger reaction to light and limitation and maybe be more sensitive with their densities dropping off. So what did we find?
Which color is which?
Oh, yeah, sorry. The light green here is gap specialists. And so I'm thinking maybe the gap specialists kind of more sensitive, a little bit more bend. Probably not as common. That's why they're lower. And then the more shade tolerant, the darker green, it's shady. They have dark green leaves. And yes, the same problem here. So they both kind of ramp up potentially a higher sensitivity by gap specialists. So here's some data. What I'm showing here are the 20 bins. And I kind of wanted to show you the ends of this represent the 25th and 75th percentile. So there's variation. If I were to plot the confidence intervals, they get swallowed up. They're basically within the size of each point. So the mean is pretty steady, which is because we're looking at a big forest area. And so the sample size is very high, the standard error is very low. And so they're pretty confident about any of these averages. If I were to plot it, you see a lot of points. But here's essentially the trend line with a lot of the variation. And what you see in this line right here is the kind of predicted scaling from an Enquist et al. Framework, which is diameter 2. And what you see is, it's not super dramatic, but there's definitely increases towards this line as they get bigger, and then kind of levels out. So there seems to be some evidence for curvature, the small sizes, that's consistent with light limitation. There's a stronger response with respect to kind of deviation and kind of shade gap when we look at density. So this is the density per hectare. What you see here is, let's think here. So this is, again, the shade, so the gap specialists. They're much less common than the shade ones. And they really peel off, very far from kind of a power law. And they also kind of deviate at the ends. The black here is kind of all species. So some species we weren't able to classify because there wasn't enough data. So this is shade gap plus unclassified is all. Most species are very shade tolerant, so the patterns are quite similar to the shade tolerant. So here's an example. So this case, for these densities, this is the range between years. So density is just a sum. There's just kind of one number. It's not like a mean with a standard error. But we show the range from 7 years. So these patterns are fairly consistent. 7 year, it's a 35-year window, 5-year census, so 7 different censuses. Relatively modest range in log space. And you're seeing deviation at the kind of top and bottom, kind of fitting the predictions. If we put this together, what you see here is a little bit of leveling off in the middle, kind of, the energy equivalence idea would be a flat line. So if I summed up the growth of every individual, that's 0 to 10 centimeters, and 10 to 20 centimeters, and 20 to 30, and then added that up, what I get is these values here. So these are 20 bins, and then we kind of drop off a little bit past 100 centimeters. But pretty systematic deviation here. This is nearly 2 orders of magnitude for gap specialists, right? So they peak around here. It's probably around 60 to 0.8 or something. So nearly 2 orders of magnitude there, about an order of magnitude for these shade-tolerant species. And then they drop off quite a bit. Now, as you get to the larger sizes, they get more and more rare. So the variation is much higher. Yes?
Sorry, the black points is totals, is that right?
What's that?
Does the black points comprise the shade and non?
Yes, the black points is everything. Okay. And it comprises shade, gap, and then ones what we weren't able to classify. So it's going to be very close to the shade because that was a lot of the individuals. Most individuals are shade. And then we get a little, more range. You might only have a handful of individuals of this size at any mortality given year. can cause more variation there. So there's more uncertainty at the very biggest sizes. And some uncertainty at the smallest sizes, where you can get patterns of masting or maybe a lot of herbivory, so there's a little more fluctuation there. And then the kind of annual means don't change quite as much. But the trend line's pretty kind of systematic. One thing that's kind of interesting, you might have noticed, is that there's a real shift in the kind of shade gap density. And so you see maybe a little bit with size, but size is kind of confounded with light availability. But not all small individuals are in the shade. Sometimes they're in a gap. So if we plot essentially the light capture per crown area, so we have allometric relations linking the crown area to the diameter, so we can get a sense of kind of the crown area, and then we have from the modeling a measure of how much light they're getting. So we kind of divide through by crown area to get basically per unit area how much is the individual getting, whether it's in the canopy with a huge crown or a small tree. Is it getting a lot of light or a little light? And then for each bin, what's this shade gap kind of ratio? And so you see, with really low amounts of light, there might be 50 times more shade-tolerant trees. They're always more common, but it might drop down to 5 times more around here. And then a lot of shade-tolerant ones just don't get gap specialists don't get very big. So this would kind of fit an idea of a live fast, die young, where they don't invest a lot in the longevity. Wood density can be lower, the size get lower. And so after you get to, if you get to the very top of the canopy where you're maybe an emergent with lots of light, a lot of these gap specialists are pretty rare. So then it starts to deviate from that. But pretty systematic drop up towards the canopy. And because of that, the shade gap production rates are going to be very similar. So we have, so it's a very similar pattern if we wanted to think about the kind of rate of production. And if we just wanted to look at the shade tolerance score, so we can rank all the individuals along our thing using PCA scores, using the growth rate versus mortality rate. We can rank kind of a shade tolerance score to each species, and that doesn't depend on how you kind of divide up shade versus gap. What you find is that the shade tolerance score really kind of declines systematically, and then at the end starts to shoot back up. So there's a restructuring of traits with respect to light, which you might expect, but there's been a lot of debate whether kind of light availability is a real niche structuring phenomenon. Hubble's come out, in some prominent papers suggesting it's not. But this suggests that there really is a reorganization of traits within a forest. Now, that mean pattern kind of masks quite a lot of variation. And so if we plot the interquartile ranges of shade rank, it's very big. And so in a given area, gap specialists might be a little bit favored in, say, a light area, but there's a lot of chance. Did you get a seed propagule that happened to land in this area and grow up? So for a given individual, it might be a little bit hard. Your accuracy wouldn't be very high if you were to predict whether it's shade or gap based on how much light there was, because there's a tremendous amount of variation, even though there's a systematic shift. So that's kind of these kind of two sides of the coin, I think, in forests. If you wanted to compare, say, the role of light, think more about the role of light. Now we're using kind of allometric relations of crown area that are kind of generic. So there's a little bit of kind of noise here or assumptions that there's probably real variation we're not accounting for, that differences in crown area allometries. For getting at biomass, we basically use real species-specific allometries of density to kind of predict biomass. But for crown area, aren't a lot of those. So with that said, kind of a metabolic, so that Enquist et al. Scaling theory would suggest there's an equal amount of crown area at all the size slices with an equal amount of leaves, producing equal amounts, fixing equal amounts of carbon, which leads to energy equivalence. But what this suggests is that mortality rate at a lot higher levels actually really depresses the amount of crown area relative to what could be filled, and that some light limitation at the bottom may be suppressing it as well. So you have a more of a hump-shaped function. And then if you look at the total light capture, now these guys are getting more light, so they have less crown area, but they get more light. So if you kind of consider the fact they're getting more light, you get more of this hump-shaped pattern of light capture. So this is the solar energy equivalence kind of side of things. And so if we were to compare that to the total production rates, we actually see a fairly similar shift. So the metabolic asymmetry, solar asymmetry that was suggested kind of by a naive expectation of energy equivalence on one hand with equal amounts of energy distributed, or big trees getting all the light on the other hand, it turns out it's a little bit more nuanced, and these things are actually much closer to each other. Big trees get tons of light, but they're not as common for a given kind of diameter increment. And so there's a kind of hump-shaped pattern throughout. And if we were to plot these two near each other to kind of get a sense of, if you remove the effects of area, if you're getting a certain amount of light, how much growth do you get? So we're kind of normalizing production by your crown area capture, normalizing light by your crown area as well. It's not quite strictly linear, but it's pretty close to a very systematic shift. As you get more light, your production rates go up. So, shocking news, light is important, but this is about an order of magnitude shift in a forest, so getting real amounts of light that seems to be going on, say, in a closed canopy forest. That's kind of impressive. Of course, plenty of variation. Those are the 75-25% interquartile ranges. So overall, if we're thinking of kind of the size energy rules, it seems that there's a real effect of light limitation at the lower end and a really strong effect of mortality at the upper end. And so this isn't a trivial deviation in this case. This is about an order of magnitude or more. So I would say, Enquist et al., who I've worked with, and he's actually on the paper, has described their geometric metabolic models as a zeroth order model. And you might want to layer additional information to kind of add realism. I would argue that this is an important layer of information you want to add to get some realism in that. So, how are we doing with time? All right, pretty good. Okay, so I've talked a lot about light as a kind of strong limiting resource. There can be other limiting resources, especially if you go in areas, say, that are sandy. You might have water limitation or nutrient limitation. If you go to the desert, water availability is pretty significant. And so, we could certainly expand this to look at other forest types. There's different disturbance histories. You might expect if you recently disturb it and then it starts growing back, you're dominated by small individuals. They're getting most of the energy. If you were dominated by a bunch of gap specialists, as they grow up, you might have a big cohort of shade-tolerant ones underneath, and there's a lot of light filtering through. And so then you might actually have relatively high amounts of small individuals. So there can be kind of some dynamics, depending on the disturbance history and the type of individuals making it up. I'd expect a lot of differences if I was in an area with 2 or 3 pines that were shade intolerant. And then so in this case we kind of ignored species ID to an extent to divide up by sizes. We treated it as a cofactor. For most animal studies, they just look at an average species mass and then its average, then its density. And they kind of, the assumption is if you get energy equivalence, then small things are getting as much as big things, and to some extent a small species is. But if there's more small species in an area, then collectively small individuals are actually getting most of the available energy. So these are kind of some nuances in how people calculate this stuff that lead to very different implications. And it's kind of really kind of poorly understood in a lot of ways. So there's been a lot of kind of prominent papers that suggest these patterns that don't consider these important distinctions, and they aren't really getting at the role of size. So that's something I kind of want to do in future research. So with that, I will wrap it up and say thank you. Thank you for all the funding, NSF, Hanover Forest, Michigan State, and thank you for your attention.